Hello. First of all, thank you to YALC for inviting us to do this. And it's a great pleasure to be talking to Gill Lewis. We haven't actually met in person. We nearly did once on a march, which we may mention later. But we've become friends on Twitter, and we share a lot of concerns about animal-related matters and climate change issues and so on. So I've thoroughly enjoyed reading a number of Gill's books. She's a really marvelous writer on animal subjects. In fact, has been described as the leading writer of animal stories for a generation. And her most recent book is this one, A Street Dog Named Pup, which has been called the Black Beauty of Dogs, and I thoroughly agree with that. And having read several now, all of Gill's books are wonderfully involving. And although she does deal with what neither she nor I want to call issues, it's not done in at all a heavy-handed way. And with every one, you're just immediately engrossed with memorable characters and plots and kept absolutely hooked. So I'm looking forward to reading many more of the ones I haven't yet come across. So thank you, Gill.
Oh, well, thank you again. Thank you for inviting me and to talk to you, Linda, because as you say, we haven't met, and this is a great opportunity to share our thoughts. And it's a real privilege to meet you. You write in such a range of age groups and such a range of styles, but all your books share a common compassion and empathy for the characters that you write about that I find really compelling. And in fact, one of my favourite books of yours is Lob, which is a beautiful story about a green man and our engagement with each other and also the wild world, and it can be in urban and rural areas, which is often central to your writing and to my writing as well. But I know you from Twitter and for your great campaigning for the environment and for empathy for animals. We met, well, we didn't meet on the march, we're both on the same march for wildlife back in 2018. So it was with huge pleasure that I was sent your latest book, This Book Is Cruelty Free. And I think the book world's been calling out for a book like this. It's a book about how we live. It's a book about how we understand our own relationship with animals and the environment. And I've got a few questions that I'd like to ask you about this book, but I just wanted to read one paragraph which really sprang out to me, which is really sort of sets up a lot of the book, where you say, and surely animals have the right to be treated with consideration, even if they can't have the same rights as humans. It doesn't follow that they have no rights at all, or that they exist solely for us to use. My view is that we should do all what we can to respect their existence, preserve their habitats, and avoid causing suffering. That means thinking about our daily lives and habits, whether or not we're in direct contact with animals. And I just love that passage because it sets up so many questions in my own mind. And it's a really beautifully structured book. But I wanted to ask you really, why did you feel compelled to write such a book? And you cover so much ground in this book. How did you bring together all those issues that you're so passionate about?
Thank you, Gill. Well, it started perhaps about 3 years ago when I was having a conversation with my agent, and she asked if I had thought of writing non-fiction. And I hadn't at all. I was busy writing fiction at that time. And I didn't immediately jump at the idea. She was thinking of sort of natural world engagement with animals of some sort. But we didn't really discuss it any further. And I didn't think much more until about 6 months on. I was thinking that my campaigning has become so much more part of my life. I've always been doing campaigning, but in recent years, I seem to have been on a protest every time I went to London, and campaigning more and more and spending more time writing to my MP and so on. And I thought, well, I really should make this central to a book. My very first young adult novel actually was about animal rights. It was about sixth form girl who gets involved with an animal rights group, and that was my very first published book.
Was that Running with Hair?
Run with the Hare, yes, that's right. Long time ago now, but I thought, although the subject has been sort of bubbling under in many of my books since, I thought I really should make it centre stage again. And then I began to wonder, well, what would be the setup? And then it occurred to me that I could write a sort of guide to compassionate living in which I could bring in everything. You couldn't do that in a novel, but in a book like this, I could cover such a range of subjects. And as you said in the introduction, I want people to think about how their lives affect animals, even if they don't particularly engage with animals, if they don't necessarily have pets or anything to do with animals, but we all affect animals in the way we live, the things we buy, the things we eat, the things we wear, and so on. And so I wanted to explore a whole range of things. So I've looked at things like choosing cruelty-free cosmetics. That's an easy change that anybody can make. I look at meat eating, of course. I look at fashion and the implications for animals and the environment. And I look at waste and what we throw away. I look at animals in zoos and tourist attractions and pets, and I look at insects and engaging with the natural world, and also about campaigning for animals. So choosing this enabled me to range quite widely and to find out an awful lot in the writing as well. So thank you. I've been looking at your websites, Gill, and I really like what comes up straight away when you look at it now, which is these different posts about aspects of a street dog named Pup. And as I said, you don't, so it's not, you wouldn't call it issue based, but with this group of dogs, Pup is dumped and becomes a street dog and has to learn to survive, and he meets this group of other dogs, and through those dogs you bring in all sorts of issues, like dog fighting. There's some really quite harrowing episodes in the story about that. There's the issue of selective breeding for short-nosed breeds, brachycephalic, is that pronounced it properly, I hope, dogs. And there's the bitch who's been bred on a puppy farm and had far too many litters of puppies. There's the foxhound who's been discarded from a hound pack. And on your website, you've got information about each of these topics separately. So I think that makes a wonderful resource for people who want to follow these things up. And there's more on your website too about things that are new to me, the coltan mining, and you've got a lovely little clip about that. So you're really using your website in the way that I'm using my book, to raise awareness and to show people how they can engage.
Yes, and what I find so interesting about your book is that I've been thinking about so many of these issues which have gone into many of my books, and just in your book we have Animals at Home, which is talking about a relationship with pet animals that we bring into our own lives, which is really what a street dog like the book A Street Dog Like Pup is about. It's about our relationship with dogs, and I'm a huge dog lover. I've been a vet, and I've seen just how important that relationship we have with dogs is. You know, they really are come into our family as part of the pack. We rely on them hugely for emotional support. They become part of our family. But on the flip side of that, I think I've seen a lot of the sort of, not the cruelty, but also perhaps some of the one of the big problems that we see is not only just sort of, I suppose, malicious cruelty towards animals, but it's this effect of not being aware of some of the issues that we impose upon them, like the brachycephalic breeding of short-nosed dogs, which have struggled with breathing. They have problems with eye problems because of the folds all around their eyes, and many of them have problems breeding. And so many people see these as lovely, cute dogs that they wish to have, and celebrities have many of these animals as types of breeds of dogs as well. But obviously there comes a huge health cost for the dogs with that. So I'd love to try to use, you know, the books to show that these dogs do suffer, and raise awareness to hopefully have encourage people not to encourage the breeding of these dogs, to go for dogs with longer noses, which have more healthier lives. So so part of our relationship with animals comes to how we see ourselves perceived on them. But again, I wanted to bring in the issues of fox hunting as well, and the disposable aspect of foxhound, which are brought into foxhounds are bred, and then when they can no longer hunt, they don't pick up a scent, or they become too old, then they're disposed of and killed and discarded. So, and that's often an unseen part of dog ownership that a lot of people don't think about or aren't aware of. So I wanted to bring those aspects as well. So it is raising awareness and trying to start a conversation. I think really that's what I'd like my book to do.
Yes, with the foxhounds as well, people are often encouraged, aren't they, to have a puppy. They call it puppy walking, to take it into their home for its first year of life until it's old enough to be introduced to the pack. And so that's all very nice, you know, you have a personal association with this foxhound, but people don't realise what happens to them at the other end of their lives. It's you know, giving a very false picture, I think, of the value of these hounds to the packs.
Yes, definitely. So I think the more sort of awareness that can be raised about the issues underlying many of the topics that we've raised, whether or not it's about looking after pets, or whether or not it's about fashion that you write so wonderfully about, how we can influence fashion, it does make a difference. One of the questions I still wanted to ask you, because some of the topics seem quite overwhelming, don't they? We can sort of,
yeah.
I was thinking about fashion, and I was thinking about using public transport. I was thinking about the food we eat. When everything seems overwhelming about what we can do as an individual, how can we really make a difference to our own lives, and how can we make a difference to the bigger picture around us as well? What would your advice be for listeners and readers now?
Thanks. Yes, I think that is a big topic, because it is so easy to look at pictures of, you know, the huge amounts of plastic that are dumped on other countries, and think, well, what difference does it actually make if I recycle my detergent bottle or whatever? But I think it's a question of sort of changing our outlook, I think. And if you make some small changes for ethical reasons, I think it makes you feel you're not buying into all of these bad things that are going on. These things are happening. They may be out of control, but we are not personally contributing. And I think once you start to feel that, you know, you're using your power of boycott in effect, aren't you? You're saying, I'm not paying for that. I'm not eating that. I'm not wearing that. And then slowly the influence spreads, I think. I mentioned the choosing of cruelty-free cosmetics. Well, everybody can do that. I don't think many people would say they actually want their cosmetics to be tested on animals. It's just that very few people think to check, because it's so easy to be influenced by an advert or an influencer on social media and go and buy a particular product. But if you start looking to make sure it's got that what you're thinking of buying has got the leaping bunny symbol on it, or Nature Watch, or the vegan symbol, then you can be sure that that product has not been tested on animals. And if you buy that, that is one less person spending money on the rest. And if you tell people why you're choosing that, or if you're shopping with friends and they all look, that one hasn't got the leaping bunny, but this one has, why don't you buy that one? You can start to influence people. And years and years ago, when I first started campaigning, the idea of buying cruelty-free cosmetics was something practically nobody had thought of. And if you wanted them, you'd have to seek for an obscure brand and probably pay more. But now you don't have to. They're in the high street. You just have to look. And so once you start looking, then that becomes part of how you think. And for young people, they can ask their their families, whoever does the shopping, please choose cruelty-free shampoo and look for the symbol. Then you can extend from that and say, well, look for that in your washing powder and your washing up liquid and everything else that you buy as well.
It's quite a powerful thing, isn't it? This idea that ripples spread outwards, because I think sometimes it feels like we can't have any power. But as you say, if you've influenced a few people around you and then more people around you, and it spreads and spreads, that can have a huge influence. And I think especially when I go into schools, I see that it's often, you know, the younger generation which are instigating many of those changes, whether or not it's saying let's go and do a beach clean or a park tidy, or we don't want plastic bottles in our school anymore, we want to do this. And actually what gives me great hope is that we've got a younger generation who are often initiating these activities, and that younger generation, when they go on to do whatever they do, whether it's being, you know, town planners or whatever, or whether they're going to conservation, they've still got those attributes. They want to bring this into whatever job they do. So I think these ripples do spread wider and wider, go further and further into the future as well.
Yes, and I think when it comes to meat eating as well, I was looking at some statistics from UK Diet Trends survey, and it said that 14% of adults are now vegetarian, which is quite a sizable, quite a significant chunk. 12% more intend to be. 50,000 people gave up meat in 2020, so 500,000 people gave up meat. Veganism is a smaller percentage, only 3% of the population is vegan, but that increased by 40% last year. And the survey found that the younger generations are most likely to be meat-free. So young people are going to be wanting vegetarian and vegan choices in schools, and they're going to be wanting more choice. Some are asking for meat-free days in schools and so on. And so that's an influence that will grow and grow. And it is growing. You've only got to look around any supermarket now to see the range that's available. I've been vegetarian now for all of my adult life. And when I began, it was definitely seen as a bit peculiar. And it would be quite hard to find things to eat. But now I'm overwhelmed with choice when I go into a supermarket, and restaurants, food outlets as well. They're all aware that they need to cater for vegans, or if they're not aware, they need to be, and I'm sure they very soon will.
And I like that in your book you mentioned that we all have these sort of grey areas. So myself, I'm vegetarian, I'm not vegan, and I know I should go more plant-based diet, and I've got that sort of level of guilt that I should make more effort to go plant-based. But in your book, you say that you mention a quote which really says that actually we don't need a small percentage of people being perfect. We need a great proportion of people being more imperfect, but yes, striving to make change.
That's right. That's where change comes about. And so in the book, I didn't want to sort of say, this is what I do, this is how to do it, because I acknowledge that I have grey areas too. But my point is that I do try, and that trying sort of underpins most things that I do. These are things I think about every day of my life. If I'm going to buy something, I want to check, is it ethical? What's the supply chain? What's that company's position on human rights as well as animal rights? And so maybe I'm a bit of a bore about it, but you don't have to be. It's the trying, it's the being aware that is so important. You use the phrase willful blindness on your something I was reading on your website, where you say a lot of people are not deliberately cruel, but it's willful blindness. I can't remember quite the context that you were using that in. Was it to do with the phones? It may have been to do with the mobile phones.
I think it's to do with many issues, and one of the issues that I think willful blindness is seen a lot of is with the use of our uplands in the British uplands, with the sporter-driven grouse shooting.
Yes.
For those who don't know it, our uplands used to once, thousands of years ago, used to be covered in forests and trees, and over the centuries, people have cut down trees for wood, firewood and grazing. But in the last 150 years, our landscapes have been used for driven grouse shooting, which is to grow huge landscapes with heather to produce a red grouse, which is the sort of chicken-like bird which people pay thousands and thousands of pounds to come and shoot. But that chicken-like bird, the red grouse, is a favourite dinner plate for foxes, stoats, weasels and crows, and those animals are allowed to be killed legally with snares, not poison, snares, traps, and they're allowed to be shot. But there are other animals, wild animals, which are also illegally killed, and those include many birds of prey like hen harriers, golden eagles, white-tailed eagles, goshawks, and those animals are shot, trapped and poisoned. And I think there's willful blindness to the extent of the killings of these wild animals, not only the cruelty to those animals that are legally trapped, but also to the intensification of the killing of raptors, which birds of prey, and the driven grouse shooting industry has actually prevented the recovery of golden eagles and hen harriers. We know that that's a fact, and it's this willful blindness that we can allow this to carry on when it's actually underpinned wholly by crime, and it's given excuses for this. But what I think has been so encouraging in the last few years is this collective consciousness that we're talking about, whether or not it comes with veganism, whether it comes with the products that we use for makeups, or whether or not it comes with collective consciousness that actually we really need to bring the wild back into our lives. And rewilding has become such a hot topic, quite rightly, to bring the wild back. And we really need to bring the wild back into these upland places to take away the driven grouse shooting and let the wild come back for carbon capture, for biodiversity, for clean water, clean air. And we also need to bring it back into our cities as well, rewild our cities with trees and our parks and our gardens. And I think that's what's been wonderful to see in these last few years, is people really taking notice and not mowing their lawns and providing bee stations. And
yes,
it's been wonderful.
Yes, that's become so important, hasn't it? I think perhaps particularly during the pandemic, where people have really valued being able to go out to a park if they can, or the countryside, or a river bank, and yes, to be growing things themselves and encouraging bees and providing habitats for toads and all sorts of things that you can do. Even if you haven't got a garden, you can have a window box and grow plants for pollinators. It's there are links to mental health, aren't there, with being exposed to the natural world. And of course, it's so important that that young generations do learn about the natural world and do have those experiences, because otherwise, if people live in cities and don't have any experience of wild nature, why will they care about it and want to protect it? But I think now schools are so good at having their own little gardens if they've got space, and there are forest schools, and children are learning so much about nature, and they will grow up with it, as you say.
It is. I think so many people are trying to make a difference, and yet it's hard then when you see some areas which are due for redevelopments, whether or not these are rural areas or urban areas, where places with wildlife are being destroyed, and it's hard I think for young people when they see they're really sort of working hard to have their own wild area, and they can see that down the road there's going to be a building development. So it's trying to think, well, what can a young person do when they see these changes going on? How can they make a difference? It's a hard call, isn't it?
It is, yes. In the book, I look at ways of campaigning. The great variety of ways you can campaign and protest, and the importance of trying to keep up morale for yourself, because I know, and I'm sure you do, Gill, that the scale of cruelty is sometimes so immense that some days I just look at what's in my inbox and think, why, it's out of control, why am I even bothering? But I mean, of course I will bother. And to set against that, I think you need to link up with some inspiring people, follow them on social media. So I would say follow Gill for one, follow people like Gill, follow Earthling Ed, follow Megan McCubbin and Chris Packham. And then you know that you're not alone. You know, there are people who feel passionately about these things. And also engaging with specific projects, I think, is important, because if you try and sort of survey the whole range of cruelty and devastation, well, then it is overwhelming. But you can say, well, I'm going to focus on this campaign, like Wild Justice, for instance, which I know you're involved with, Jill, and I'm a supporter as well. And then you begin to see results. You can feel, well, I'm behind something that is going to make a difference. So I think things like that are really important, to sort of link up with the people who know, and to celebrate the good things that happen alongside all the awfulness. Could you say a bit more about Wild Justice, Jill, and your involvement with it?
Yes, well, Wild Justice is formed by three people I admire, actually: Chris Packham, Mark Avery and Ruth Tingay, and they're all campaigners for environmental justice, and I think they've together for 2 years as a group, and they really challenge they challenge the status quo and ask big questions of the government and of organisations. They're challenging general licenses, which general licenses are given to, whether they're given to farmers or to shooting organisations to be able to control, to kill crows, corvids and foxes, and to really think, well, do we really need to be killing this many wild animals? There has to be a good reason behind it. And that's a status quo which lots of people are fighting against, saying, well, it's been like this for many years, so why change now? But they are really questioning it. They're questioning the ethics of the way badgers are being killed. They're questioning the ethics of burning over peatland. Yeah. So they're really bringing some of the really impertinent questions, which I often feel that larger sort of non-government organisations don't press enough. So they really are standing out, asking the big questions and asking for change. And I think we've seen really through history that those are the people that make change, whether or not, for one of my books, The Closest Thing to Flying, I look back at the founders of the RSPB, the bird charity. And those initial founders were women, and they challenged the use of feathers in fashion. So they really stepped out of their lane. They challenged the status quo. Everybody wanted the feathers in fashion. They said people would lose their jobs. But they said, no, this is ethically wrong, and there won't be enough birds left in the world if we go plundering the wild world. So they were great icons really for change. Other people that step out of the lane, Greta Thunberg, she's stepped out and really called about climate change, and many others like her. And again, Wild Justice are doing the same. They are asking the big questions sometimes that people are too timid to ask or challenge.
Yes, and having good results already. I think you're also involved with Hen Harrier Day.
Yes, so I'm also a trustee of Hen Harrier Action, which is it's a charity really to raise awareness about the plight of the hen harrier, which is involved with driven grouse shooting, as I was discussing earlier, and it's to celebrate this bird. And what we really want to do is raise awareness, tell people about the plight of the hen harrier, but really have a very much forward vision of saying, well, actually, we know the answer, we know the changes we need to see. We need to restore the wild to our uplands. We need to restore, so many habitats, and through doing that, and through my personal opinion is to ban driven grouse shooting, then we can see this rich biodiversity coming back. So yes, I'm actively involved, and it's just closed. I've been running a writing competition as well for young people, with some super prizes of books by lots of sort of best-loved authors. So it's been great fun to do that.
Did you get a good response?
Yes, and the standard of writing is incredibly high. I think we've got some authors of the future looking at some of the entries, And it's lovely to see so many people really engaged, not only with wildlife, but wildlife around their own homes, whether or not it's just watching ants walking along a patio. It's all those engagements with the natural world and our own local environment, which actually sets up that love of wildlife for life. I mean, I grew up on the edge of a city in a sort of just a sort of ordinary semi-detached house with we had a very long garden because it was on a very steep hill, but that was where I really learnt to love wildlife. You know, found snails and slugs and ants and everything like that, and that's what sort of took me on, really.
Yes, it's so important to value the ordinary, or what we think of as ordinary creatures around us, and not just to think about the iconic animals like giant pandas and polar bears, but of course they're important, but so also are the house sparrows and the water voles and the squirrels and the things around us,
yes,
some of which are also under threat.
In your book, you mention about which is more important, the panda bear or the earthworm. Could earthworms be more important than the giant panda bear?
Yeah, that idea came from a researcher called Sarah Johnson. She wrote an article about it, and it's about ecosystems, really, because the giant panda is a wonderful animal, and of course it would be terrible to see it go extinct. But it doesn't actually really have a key influence on its ecosystem, because they're solitary animals. They range from miles in forest, and they eat bamboo. So if there were no pandas there, that habitat wouldn't be significantly changed. There'd be a bit more bamboo, but they're not predators like wolves are, so they don't affect their ecosystem in that way. Whereas the earthworm is crucial to our farming, our horticulture, our food crops, and so on. And if we had no earthworms, we would be in serious trouble. So we need to regard them as, you know, supremely important. Charles Darwin recognized that. He was fascinated by earthworms and wrote a study of them. So yes, I wanted to focus on there's a section of the book about ecosystems and how they function, and how if you take out one creature from an ecosystem, it can have serious effects, and the effects sort of trickle down. There was a great example of that in the Yellowstone Park, where for a long time there were no wolves. And because there were no wolves, the elk could multiply. The elk had nothing to be afraid of, so they would be by the rivers grazing. They would graze all the scrub and grasses by the side of the river, which meant that the soil was eroding, and all the other the insects and invertebrates that would have flourished there weren't, because their habitat had become quite sparse. But when the wolves were reintroduced, the elk was still there, but the wolves killed some of them, and they learned to be wary and to stay away from the wolves, and so they were hiding in forests and not grazing openly by the river. And that meant that the scrub regrew, and with the scrub came insects and invertebrates and birds of prey, and even the shape of the river changed, because instead of being a fast flowing river, it was slowed, and so bends developed in the river, and it improved the whole chain, the whole ecosystem there. So it's fascinating to think how sometimes human interference, you know, we can take out a creature without realizing what the knock-on effect will be.
Oh, I think absolutely, it's fascinating. And I think also we can put in a creature and see diverse change. And in this country now, we're introducing the beaver, which, like the wolf, is a keystone species, isn't it?
Yes.
They use this term keystone, these animals which can change landscapes and change. And it's extraordinary to see in places in Britain and across Europe where the beaver was once extinct has come back, and it's changing the course of rivers by making dams. It's damming, creating wetlands, slowing the course of rivers to reduce flooding downstream, making rivers healthier for fish and for so many other animals. It's wonderful. And I think I really like in your book where you're talking about captive animals and show animals, and it's talking about the ethics of zoos. And I think one of the biggest things that we that really needs to be addressed is maintaining habitats, isn't it? Creating habitats for wild space for animals. Otherwise, zoos become nothing more than these arcs, really, with animals with nowhere to go. And from a personal angle, I'm actually against zoos on the whole. I understand that some animals that have been rescued from some areas can't go back into the wild. So I think we do need, and as you say in your book, sanctuaries really for the animals which don't have a choice to go back into the wild, but certainly keeping and extending wild places, wild habitats for wild animals, and something that the World Land Trust, the charity, do really well is to create habitats and for animals to have a thriving space to be wild in.
Yes, that obviously is more important. Yes, and I think the best zoos, the leading zoos in the world, do all have projects to maintain wild areas, restore wild areas, as well as the work they do for their own animals. That was an area where I felt least certain of what my views were really about zoos, because there are some desperately awful zoos around the world, aren't there, which really probably don't deserve the name of zoo. They're more tourist attractions.
Yes. And I think I'd like to think that the more that we can protect wild spaces, that's the place where we'll have the natural sort of breeding areas for animals, because animals in captivity can never truly be wild in their behavior. And I think that's what I struggle with the ethics of zoos, keeping animals caged for what purpose. We need to protect the wild space for them. That's the most important thing. And with many, I think, and with many zoos, many of the animals are kept, which aren't on the sort of conservation list, but are there more as sort of attractions. There's a big question of what to do with the surplus animals when they breed them. There's a lot of sort of culling of animals in zoos, killing of animals in zoos, which they become surplus to need, really, which I find that jars very ethically. That I think that's why one of the bigger reasons why I'm become more anti-zoo as I've researched more of it.
Yes, and zoos know that the public like to see baby animals, so that tends to mean that they breed too many, just so that they will have a constant supply of baby animals. And then where are they going to go? Yes, you're right. The culling of zoo animals is another thing that's on the whole kept well out of sight, isn't it?
Yes, and again, so it's that willful blindness to wanting to go along and see something rather cute and not wanting to know anything more about it. A little bit like I think we were discussing about the breeding of racehorses. A lot of people like to go along to the races to put a bet. It's quite an event. It's quite exciting. There's big crowds. It's tradition. And again, that willful blindness with the racehorses is all these racehorses that end up going to slaughterhouses. Again, it's not something people want to think about because it's uncomfortable to think about. It's easier to push to the back of your mind when you're going along and placing a bet on a horse, isn't it? That's right, yes. Did you watch the Panorama programme last night? I didn't, but I'm going to watch it on replay. But I've been aware of, with those issues being a vet. I mean, I do see some, many people who do take thoroughbreds on as riding horses, but there are just simply too many to go into the leisure sort of. That's right. For riding. Yes, and they're quite specialised, really, aren't they? They're expensive to keep. They're not for everybody, not for the average rider, perhaps. And some of them are very young when they're discarded from racing. So it's another issue where just too many animals are bred, really, and when they cease to be profitable, they're discarded. But we better finish on a positive note, haven't we? Is it? I think we better draw our conversation to a close. Yes. There is a lot. I think there is a lot to be really positive about. I think it just in the last 10 years, I think there's been a huge amount of change with attitudes towards climate change, towards rewilding. And globally, not just nationally or even on a small communities, I think it really has been something that's been brought far more to the fore. But we need big corporations and governments to listen, don't we?
Absolutely, we do, yes, because yes, we want the governments, the world leaders, to take decisive action, and we do what we can as individuals, but the two need to go hand in hand, yes, if we're going to see change. We were talking earlier about how children's literature plays a part in influencing the young generation, and how at the moment there's this great burgeoning of books, of picture books, story books, information books, all kinds of books about nature and wildlife and engagement with nature, and little projects people can take on and big projects people can take on. And that's a hope for the future, isn't it?
I think it's a huge hope. I mean, two books I'd like to mention, because I think they're really influential books, is one is The Lost Words, illustrated by Jackie Morris and written by Robert Macfarlane, and how they responded to the fact that language, computer studies showed that nature words were slipping from our language. They were just disappearing from our language, from the words that parents pass on to the children. So bluebell, dandelion, all these words were falling out of use. And so they reacted to that, and they wanted to bring them back into our language. And the most, the Lost Words, for anybody that's read it, is such a beautiful book. And it's gone into schools, into hospices, into communities. It's really sort of changed, how so many people see the wild world, just from a simple dandelion that we sometimes don't look at, to look at it again, which I love. So I think that's a really important book. And another book, Dara McNulty's Diary of a Young Naturalist, really shows us how to really appreciate what's in our own environment, but also how to look at the bigger picture as well. Because I think children's books can have a profound effect on readers. And I think we share the same love of Black Beauty.
Yes.
I know that it was one of your favourite books, wasn't it? How did that change you?
Well, I think it was one of the first books I can remember reading as a child. I had an abridged version because I don't know how old I was, about 7 or 8, I think. And I had an abridged version with illustrations. And I can still remember those pictures so vividly. And it just struck me, how animals are at the mercy of humans, and how Black Beauty's fate was, fairly random, depending on who bought him, who he ended up with. Yes, that had a lasting impact on me, and you too.
Yes, and I think it was when I was researching it later on as an adult, and realizing, how a book did influence people's view to horse welfare at a time when horses again were seen as a bit disposable when they were used for, drawing carriages and riding, and it changed one of the laws, for the check rein, which was held horses' heads in a fixed angle, so it changed some welfare aspects at the time. And but I think the burgeoning of children's books at the moment, with talking about our connection with wildlife, can only just do one thing, which is to share, a love and a knowledge of wildlife and wild places. And that again goes into our collective consciousness that actually this planet needs protecting, and that together we can all do it.
Yes, it's inspiring. One thing that did inspire me while I was researching the book was to realize how many organizations there are with different specialities, whether it's practically saving animals, looking after animals, or engaged with environmental projects, or combating cruelty. There are so many people who are passionately dedicated to their particular focus, and that I did find encouraging.
Definitely. And I think it's in your book you talk about how to sort of see how we live our lives to influence others as well. And I think that that's so important to come from individuals, to have this, as we spoke earlier, to have this ripple effect spreading outwards and making changes, not only in the here and now, but if this collective, this groundswell of consciousness reaches up as a younger generation come through, who are seem to be many more aware of the dangers, the outcomes of climate change compared to many of the older generations. It's their future, and I just hope that they take it forward and make real changes. But there have been, you were talking earlier about some of the big changes that have been made since you've finished writing the book.
Yes. Yes, in between the time when I submitted my final edits to Pavilion and the book actually appearing, so that's what, a couple of months, there have been several pieces of good news. One is that the government now has introduced a bill to ban live exports, so that's sending cattle and sheep by sea to other countries. Hopefully there will be a ban, I certainly hope so. That's one of the key campaigns of compassion in world farming. The EU is phasing out cages for animals in farming, so cages for hens, rabbits, ducks and geese and farrowing pigs. I hope we will follow now that we're no longer in the EU. The UK government increased penalties for animal cruelty, which used to be a pathetic 6 months prison sentence. That was the maximum, now gone up to 5 years. Still not enough, but a better deterrent. And Israel became the first country in the world to ban the sale of fur. So those are things that have happened just in the last couple of months. And I think it's important to note these changes and to tweet about them, you know, to encourage people, because those changes have come about because of people like us, people using their voices. The organizations that got behind them, of course, set things off, but they need the support of people like us to sign petitions, to write to our MPs, to tell people to use our voices. So that's all very encouraging too. Lots more needs to be changed, but things do change.
Yeah, definitely. And if I could ask you perhaps to finish, or perhaps we could think of perhaps 3 things that we would like to see changing in the next sort of 5 years. What would be your 3 things?
Oh gosh, right. Well, certainly I would like that ban on live exports, not just in the UK, but all over the world, because that is something that, you know, could be changed. It means sending meat rather than live animals. That could be changed. So that would be one. This is this is hard. I would like to see
small or big doesn't matter.
Yes, I would like decisive action on climate change, please, world leaders, starting at COP26 later this year. I would like vegan meals to become the norm, vegan and vegetarian meals to become the norm, and for meat eating to be considered a bit peculiar and a bit last century. What are your 3?
So I think my 3, one of the big things that I campaign about is to ban driven grouse shooting. So
yeah.
That's my top, and I think it'll happen. I think we're heading that way. So ban driven grouse shooting. I would love a ban on single-use plastics.
Yes.
Because once people don't have a choice, they adapt. You know, now people have to pay for a plastic bag. Everyone remembers to take their plastic bag to the supermarket. So if we don't have plastic on vegetables, etc., we just get used to it so quickly. So those are 2 things.
Yeah.
And the 3rd thing, I would like to see that every city and every council city has to provision for a percentage of wild space. So whether or not it's on roundabouts or verges or parks or areas like that, it has to be put for wild space, not mowed and tidied up. We've got an obsession with tidying.
We have, yes. Well, I'll certainly support all your 3 things, Jill.
And I'll support yours.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's been such a pleasure to chat to you, Jill, and to meet you virtually, and I hope we'll meet in person before very long.
Maybe on another march.
Keep writing those wonderful books.
Thank you, and thank you for yours.
Thank you.